All right. We are recording here with a Greek name, so Eurydice. Did I get, or is
Yeah,
it? Or
that's how I say it.
you could
Yes.
also say Eurydice or Eurydice if
Yep.
you're feeling Italian. But um, you've done some Substack writing. I believe you've done some interviews. So you have some things to say, and as per usual with these interviews, I don't know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about whatever we end up talking about. It's pretty freeform. It's pretty spontaneous. At the top of your Substack right now, you've got an article, Fertility in an IQ Currency Civilization, saying that a society where opportunities for status and material comfort demand G-loaded skills is a society with low fertility. So I actually have an article I'm working on, which discusses this a little bit more from the education angle, but I think there's probably some crossover, trying to understand, what do we value as a society? How does that impact fertility? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Um, Explain your perspective. Okay, kind of unpack that, for I mean, you're using so status and material comfort. Haven't we always had opportunities for status and material comfort, or are you saying that we're more meritocratic, where there's more social mobility, and that's what's creating this pressure versus a 13th century French peasant or something like that?
I would say this this piece is the kind of thing that a year or so ago or two ago I might have written as a Twitter thread that was meant to be a little bit more tongue in cheek than how this ended up coming out, which has this really dry tone, but it's not exactly a position that I hold with zero irony. So when you ask me what I meant by it, it's interesting to actually be asked to defend what I wrote, because I do think there's a level at which society has reorganized itself away from systems that were at least a little bit more functional. I have mixed feelings about it because I think a lot of the societal reorganization has these really positive second and third order effects. Broadly speaking, I tend much more techno positive, if you will, than Luddite. I am a big fan of the Industrial Revolution. I'm a fan of the rise of capitalism and of the ways that it makes it possible for there to be more social mobility and for more people to trade on something like IQ rather than having to do subsistence farming, right? Which seems in many ways to have some downsides that our current life does not have. And a lot of my perspectives are interested in figuring out whether there are ways to capture some of the good things that we lost in some of our technological advances without having to turn back the clock and really Kaczynski our way out of the problem. So I think it's great to be able, as a woman, to have my IQ be rewarded monetarily. I think it's great that I got to go to school. I really have enjoyed the work I've gotten to do over time, and I think it's enriching for me as a person, and it's positive for sort of female autonomy broadly that we work that way. And I think it's also pretty clear that prior to the Industrial Revolution, when people were doing this sort of subsistence farming or family business, you had a family unit that had a function that worked a lot better for, I think, all people involved. If you had your kids at home most of the time and you had your spouse at home most of the time working most of the same hours you were on the same enterprise you were working on, there was a lot better argument for you to have children, couple up, etc. Like these things were all binned together, and there were positives from that. Individuality has huge positives in terms of individual sovereignty, but I think there's limitations in terms of being able to connect. And unfortunately, there's only so far we can stray from our evolutionary history as these deeply cooperative primates. We need each other, we need communities, and we're still finding ways to balance that. All this to say, my piece on fertility decreasing in a world that rewards IQ is broadly based on an observation that when we talk about developed countries, we are largely talking about countries that are increasingly capitalist, that increasingly award the highest status and the highest monetary compensation for IQ related pursuits overwhelmingly. And those systems tend to allow women to participate in the workforce more. They tend to be more permissive of arguments that women should be allowed to work. And they're, less interested in religious reasoning that demands conformity. And all of this adds up to women have these opportunities that they didn't have. They don't want to have kids as young as they did. And there might be ways to sort of change up what we're doing such that if women want more kids than they're having, we could make that happen. And if there were couplings that could happen with slightly different tweaks, we could maybe increase those as well. But it would require that we pay attention to sort of what we're trading off on.
Yeah. So, in terms of material reality, I have a difficult time, and this might not really be the argument that you're making, but when people say, I think even J.D. Vance at the vice presidential debate, he said, if conservatives want to limit abortion, then reciprocally they also have to provide people with like a material incentive to have kids. Like they need cheaper housing and they need employment opportunities and they need high wages and they need all these things. So this is kind of the bargain that he's trying to make is, if you let us restrict your reproductive rights somewhat, in exchange, we'll give you a better economy. I don't think that is actually like the way this thing works. I don't think that, when I look at billionaires or people who have an unlimited capacity, wealthy women, for example, I think there's some data to suggest that wealthy men do tend to have more children. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that's the case. So, like, there could be some kind of loose correlation at some level of income, or some kind of positive correlation, because I think normally we think there's a negative correlation. But I think that if you increased, if you said, we're going to put you on UBI, we're going to put you on a stipend, you don't have to worry about employment anymore, your material conditions are taken care of, you don't have to strive in this capitalist economy, you're free to just do whatever you want. I'm not sure what the impact on fertility would be and how strong it would be versus something like religion. So rather than seeing the capitalistic rat race and this competition to become more and more educated and more qualified and to be a professional woman, is that negatively impacting fertility? I think that is the pretty standard argument, and I'm not. I wouldn't say it's entirely false, but I do feel like it's not so much in the presence of a negative, but it's the absence of a positive. Is the decline in religiousness, and the evidence that I would have for that would be to say that I think aristocratic women in the 17th century or something were the most educated women in society, and they also had very high fertility. So I don't think necessarily, and maybe that's because their social role was well defined and there wasn't this middle class anxiety that I think a lot of people feel, which is if I don't become as educated as my parents, if I don't do as well as my parents, then I will have failed as a daughter. I will have failed society, and so there's this pressure to keep up with the Joneses, and that could be part of it. And certainly aristocratic women weren't like, pressed for time and opportunity. And also they had and this was normalized as well, is we talk a lot about like nannies and, can a person afford childcare, which is an esoteric form of nannies? Can you afford to send your kids to a school or the right school? Can you afford to live in the right neighborhood to send your kids to the right school? Aristocratic women had a lot of those questions taken care of because they had nannies, they had tutors, all of that was provided. Also, the question of women working, yeah, outside of aristocratic women, all women worked. It was just they did very different types of labor. It was manual labor versus intellectual labor. So is there like a cognitive drain that comes from intellectualism that makes child rearing more difficult? I'm open to that possibility. But yeah, I guess I would say I think that if I had to say the best bang for your buck if you want to increase fertility is to become more religious. I don't think there's any other single factor that is as important. Economic, other sociological factors. So yeah, if they want to do that, they have to become more religious. Now, what does that mean, and what religious sect is best? Maybe that's confusing if we get into the details, but as I understand it, you come from a Mormon background. Is that correct?
That is true, yes.
And so, as we're grappling with these questions, I mean, I'm happy to go as personal or as little personal as you like, but what do you feel that are you positive or are you sympathetic to, if you think fertility is a problem, well, let's just make people more religious. Do you think that's possible? Do you think that's ethical? Or do you think that's problematic?
So I definitely understand that argument. Part of what I get into in my essay is that IQ as a desired good tends to correlate really heavily with a decrease in interest in religion and an increase in individualism on a society wide basis. And so I sort of have a similar take that you do with a bit of a different cause and effect relationship, which is that the more you reward people for high IQ and the more you demand that people use their IQ to get ahead, the more they're going to lean on reason and rationality. And those are good things, but I would argue that those things do sort of naturally tend to lead people away from, at minimum, traditional religions, and to some extent, even the more eccentric definition that you've used of religions, which includes, modern leftism, if you want to call that a religion. I think that religiosity is pretty helpful when it comes to fertility. There are trade-offs for traditional religions, and I think it is often underappreciated that some of our memes, which attend to our IQ above all else culture, are religious in a sense, and they are actively antinatalist, which is another thing that I mentioned in my piece. So I think our focus on IQ tends to encourage a non-humanist view of humanity, essentially, to rather than adhering to a Christian or post-Christian view that all people are created equal, there's an increasing tendency to view people in terms of their value directly related to their capitalist value, and obviously in particular their IQ. And that is a religious belief rather than a provable stance, which is not often discussed in that way, which can frustrate me. And while this is a bit of a strong claim, I do genuinely think that the stance that not all people are of equal value is a profoundly antinatalist religious viewpoint that is very popular. And the more popular it gets, the more women will feel that their reasoning for having children is going to shrink, and specifically their religious reasoning, things that appeal to them on a visceral level, will shrink. Yeah. I'm not sure how well, I don't know, I've turned that around in my head a fair amount. I do feel reasonably confident in saying that one of the reasons why traditional religions like Christianity are so highly correlated with pronatalism is that most traditional religions with high fertility have some sort of stance that approves all human life as valuable in a baseline way, even if they recognize and accept hierarchy in some particular way. Whereas our view of hierarchy as we lose religion tends to be more totalizing and more capitalistic in a way that I think is fundamentally alienating to a lot of people, and especially to women.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought of that in that particular way, but I'm inclined to be sympathetic toward this. If I were to turn back the clock to a pre-Christian period, or try to imagine what that would be like, there does seem to be an indication from anthropology studying primitive societies that things like infanticide are permissible, child
Mhm.
exposure are permissible. Those things continued to exist in medieval Europe. They weren't abolished. But I think ethically, morally, Christianity has a much harsher view or more critical view of things like infanticide and certainly child sacrifice or exposure than primitive pagan religions. So I'm kind of presenting a historical view here where it's not simply that in the past we had higher fertility and now we have lower fertility and it's linear, but rather that for pre-agricultural primitive societies, they probably saw, I mean, children as a necessary or a natural consequence of sexual activity, and so there was a natural urge to have children which existed, but it's not clear that they were in favor of natalist maximalism in the way that later religious forms, egalitarian religious forms, came to be. And I think that, even prior to Christianity, looking at different religions, and implicit egalitarianism, say within Zoroastrianism and certain forms of even Egyptian religion. Certainly, if you look at the pre-Vedic Upanishadic tradition of Dravidian India, there does seem to be some kind of egalitarianism regarding the nature of the soul and reincarnation and the nature of mortality and death and the afterlife, versus these nomadic, non-agricultural forms of religion where there's much more an emphasis on excellence. You see that in Greece with Pindar and the Olympics, that there are certain forms of life which are unworthy, which are, slave. There's this American phrase, still, I think it's the motto of New Hampshire: give me liberty or give me death. And that term, liberty, I mean, etymologically, it means freedom. But what did freedom mean to the ancient world? Machiavelli talks about freedom. How does he define freedom? Well, he doesn't define it as licentiousness or sexual libertinism or something like that. But he says freedom is sovereignty. Freedom is the ability to not be defeated and captured, enslaved. And so in some ways, freedom is very tied in with military victory and aristocracy, the ability to make laws, the ability to stand in exception to those laws. So that conception of freedom that the Greeks had, I think, is inherited from a non-agricultural worldview, because they had a class-based distinction between those who were, in India, the Sanskrit term is Shudra, those who are craftsmen, those who are workers, those who are Benausic, those who work the fields, and then the aristocracy, which had this idea of we don't need to do that. We don't need to work. We are primarily bred for war, and therefore we are free. So, yeah, contrasting those two views of the world, one of which says, everybody is equal and have the most amount of children as possible. Children are a blessing. Poverty even is good because it allows you to be humble, and humility is good. All of those forms of religion, I think, actually precede Christianity, but obviously Christianity takes it perhaps to a new level. But there is this non-Christian or pre-Christian element which doesn't necessarily endorse like infinite natalism or maximal natalism, but does have this view that human life is not uniform and there are differentiations in nature between physis is the Greek term. So there's differentiations between people inherently based on their class, based on their caste, based on their lineage, is what the European aristocracy believed, that because I am descended from Charlemagne, I am a superior sort of human in the great chain of being than someone who is not. And they respected even the concept of non-European nobility. So, for instance, in Kiev, there were intermarriages between European nobility and Mongolian nobility because they both recognized, well, you're aristocrats, you're warriors, you're free, and therefore you're noble. They recognized that actually across racial lines. So, yeah, I guess that would be my that would be me taking what is fundamentally a dualistic opposition or a dyad, between natalism and what you're saying is this inegalitarian worldview. These are opposites, but the way that they've related to each other over the course of history is not necessarily linear. It's not that, well, in the past we were all egalitarian and we all valued life. That is true in the short term of we're now kind of moving away from Christianity and previously we were Christian. But over an even longer term, I think you could make the argument that originally this hierarchical view of life that you're saying is now centered on IQ, previously it was a hierarchical view of life based off physical excellence and performance in warfare. And that kind of linguistically, that Indo-European paganism is significant toward shaping these cultures. So it's kind of like a sandwich. Like at the deepest level of culture, we probably do have this inegalitarian concept, and then layered on top of that is this Christianity, which comes in and imposes itself and says, no, we're all equal. And now we're as Christianity is declining, we're starting to introduce a new form of inegalitarianism, which is based on, how well you can take a test, how well you can perform in an office environment or something like that. Is that, have I gone off the rails here? Have I taken us too far away from a reality? What do you think about
These are
that?
some really interesting thoughts and some broadly compelling analysis. I think I would add that context is a critical part shaping our culture in all contexts. So you have pre-agriculture, you're going to have largely, hunter-gatherer tribes. You're going to see more small-scale evaluations and cost-benefit analyses that look much more personal and much more family-based, much more clan-based, et cetera. Once you get into agriculture, there is a recognizable trade-off between how well your family is going to do, how well your farm is going to do, and how many people are working it to some extent. There's a ceiling on that number, but until you hit that, you're going to get a better return on your investment for a higher number of people. And then, of course, in this current age, we are losing the connectivity between economic growth and individual people as we automate and as we especially turn into AI. But there is not a full disconnect from those two as of yet. And the population that we have right now will require a certain level of population for comfortable sustenance as they age, comfortable sustainment. So broadly, I think you bring up some valid points. I think it's important from my perspective to note the ways that these different egalitarian versus inegalitarian frameworks reflect the economies that they were working within and also reflect the value systems they were working within, because the previous inegalitarian frameworks were broadly, it would be extremely excessive to say that previous inegalitarian frameworks in, for example, pre-agriculture or ancient Greece produce children in large measure via turning the other way when it comes to rape, but there is a high likelihood that those kinds of inegalitarian approaches allowed for considerably more children who were produced that way. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was even necessarily half of them, but it was certainly more than it is today because our value systems have changed. So you have this interplay between value systems, religiosity, and especially the economics of the whole thing. And our current context right now can't exactly afford to take on values that upheld a Greek economic system that doesn't exist for us. So while there are relevant concepts to analyze when it comes to the past, those things exist in relation to what every single culture that held those ideas was trying to accomplish. And given where we're at right now, I think the immediate past of Christianity is extremely relevant, in part because we certainly do have a culture that is pretty anti having children by coercion, and other previous past inegalitarian societies largely did not have that, with maybe exceptions for extremely small hunter-gatherer societies that aren't replicable today in a functional way.
Yeah, I guess as you're saying that, I want to amend that tripartite model of saying there's the, pre-Christianity is inegalitarian, and then Christianity is egalitarian, and then post-Christianity is inegalitarian again. I want to amend that to say that tribal societies were egalitarian in the sense Marx says it was a tribal form of communism. Everything is shared, everybody's family. I mean, we all have a family, or we have reference to families where, you share a house. You don't extract rent from your children. You don't expect children to, pay you back in a sense of like after 18 years, you itemize all of your expenses, and then you say, okay, it's time for my return on investment. You're legally obligated to pay me back. So effectively, the family unit is a communist concept, and so these primitive tribal societies were probably much more egalitarian than the Greeks. And what's unique about the Greeks and that worldview is that particularly they had a self-conception within society that that tripartite division of warriors, merchants, and priests, and then the fourth class would be the workers and the farmers. Well, most people were actually doing farm work. So 90% of the people were left out of that tripart division. It was really a small, maybe 10%. It depends on the situation. It could be as high as 30% maybe, could be as little as 1%. But that idea that there are these rulers at the top, I think, has to do with the fact that these were actually large-scale agriculture, like the invasion, the Dorian invasion, the Indo-European speaking Greeks, the Mycenaeans, were predated by Minoans and other autochthonous cultures, the Etruscans, the Basque peoples. There were people in Europe. There were people doing agriculture in Britain, for example, prior to the Belviker invasions, 2500 BC. So there were already egalitarian agricultural societies which were set up in Europe and in the Middle East and India and other places. But then this nomadic warrior class came in, and from the top down took over societies and forced them to speak a new language and adopt a new culture. There was a syncretism that happened. But I think that's the root of that egalitarian idea. It's not to say that this term paganism with respect to Christianity is not very accurate. It doesn't tell us very much, because we're lumping together agricultural societies that probably worship a rain god, for example. They probably worship a god of the underworld like Pluto or Demeter, or some god of earthly wealth. And And then you've got, by contrast, these nomadic warriors who are coming in who don't really care if it rains or not because they're not growing crops. They don't really care about the earth as much because they're not planting seeds. And so what they care about is much more they're oriented toward the open sky, the steppe. And so they've got sun gods, they've got storm gods, they've got gods of hunting, which are fairly absent in pure agricultural societies. There's no reason to have a god of hunting because that's not where you get your food from. You get it from the emphasis is on agriculture. So rather than saying there's these 3 stages of history, I think it's more accurate. Maybe even we could say 5 stages. I'm getting very detailed, but now you could say the Ur primordial hunter-gatherer who's probably effectively a communist, who shares everything, everyone's family, and there's no caste, there's no class, there's no social divisions. Everyone's equal. Then you get agriculture, which says there's going to be some kind of ruling class, of astrologers and priests and whatever who are administering the Vaishya class, people who are the managerial class who are overseeing the farm work. They're directing people to say, okay, you have to plant in this month, and then we harvest in this month, and this is how we're going to distribute. Basically, they were the tax collectors. They took grain and they distributed it to people because it was a collectivized farming effort. So you get that form of egalitarianism. And then, layered on top of that, you get these nomadic invaders who then insert themselves on top of that priest class. And they say, no, it's a warrior class that's going to rule over the priest class, who then rule over the farmers. And then on top of that, you get Christianity, which says, no, above the warrior class, actually, we're going to reassert the primacy of the priest class, and we're going to reassert egalitarianism. Like, sure, you can have your aristocracy with your lineages and whatever, but just remember, before Christ, all are equal, and, it's heaven or hell. So there's this layering, there's this back and forth, very complicated through history, where you get these swings between maybe a primordial egalitarianism and agricultural introduction of one form of social hierarchy, which is not necessarily, based on heredity or something. It's not necessarily based on saying, well, I'm better than you because I come from a different lineage, but it's saying, the priest is on top because he's closer to God. He administers the sacrifice. And then you've got the warriors who come and say, no, we're on top and we have our different form of inegalitarianism. And then Christianity says, no, the warriors are subject to God's law. And then you get post-Christianity where you say, no, actually, it's capitalism that's in charge, and actually it's your IQ that matters, and it's this scientific view of human differentiation that your performance in the capitalist economy determines your wealth and value. So it's actually kind of all over the place, but I think there is a structure. I think there is a history. Now, how much did all of those changes affect fertility? It's not entirely clear. One of the things that I want to bring in here regarding egalitarianism and fertility is the fact that even at the height of Christendom in medieval Europe, there was still a demographic replacement that went on, where even though peasants were incentivized to have children, to provide labor for these farms, there was still differential mortality rates due to the fact that the aristocracy had access to unlimited food, essentially, and whatever healthcare existed at the time. People had herbs and teas and, apothecaries and kind of herbal remedies or something. But there was very clearly differential mortality rates between the aristocracy and everyone else. And if you game this out over like 7 generations, about 330 years, even a slight change, even a small difference in fertility rates, say, let's say the peasants were having 3 to 5 kids on average or whatever who survived to adulthood. It would be different at different times. The aristocracy, if they can double that, if they can have 8 kids on average, or I think Abraham Lincoln had, like 12 kids or 14 kids or something. I think half of them died, but if you can have a lot more children as an aristocrat, then you can effectively demographically swamp the lower classes. And because of primogeniture, where only the oldest son inherited property, and you didn't split up this property, it essentially meant that every generation there would be one brother who got everything, and all the other brothers would be kind of left to fend for themselves and figure it out. Now, that didn't mean they immediately became poor, but it meant that there was actually a pressure of downward mobility where eventually they go from being a very rich aristocrat to a middle aristocrat to a poor aristocrat, and you keep continuing that process, and eventually they get kicked all the way down the chain back to the peasantry. And so eventually what happens is not through immigration, this is happening within society, but eventually what happens is all of the peasants, or 90% of the peasants, in terms of their lineage, their genetics, are ultimately descended from a small group of aristocrats. And that is a process that happened in medieval Europe under Christianity, but also genetic studies indicate that this has been happening prior to Christianity. It's been happening in all sorts of societies where you have any sort of class differentiation. So in a pure classless, like communistic society, maybe you could avoid that. We've never actually had that. And so now that we're looking toward the future, there's this weird inversion where maybe for the first time in history, the people who are considered to be, at least outwardly, and I think there's a technical critique of this, but at least outwardly, we perceive that people who are more educated, more wealthy, on a very broad level, have less children. And the people who are kind of failing in capitalistic terms, especially if you compare by nation basis, we'd say, okay, poorer countries have more kids. And so, like, we're still, like, demographic replacement of one group by another, that dynamic is still going on, but it's happening in contradiction to the established social norms of what determines value. So if wealth determines value, it's like, well, wealthy people have less kids, and that's not historically usual. Usually if you value something, like, for instance, for Orthodox Judaism, the rabbis tended to have more kids. And so, versus just the general Jewish population. And so over time, basically, every Jew can trace back their lineage to a rabbi at some point because of that reason. The rabbis had more children because they valued, education and literacy and numeracy. So no matter what kind of group of people you look at, you're always going to find, that there's one group of people sort of outbreeding everybody else and replacing them. But it's generally in alignment with those moral values. And now we're kind of in this weird place where that doesn't seem to be the case. But my caveat there would be that actually, if you drill down, if you dial in, if you don't just look at the broad question, but you look specifically, you differentiate between men and women, and you also look at the highest levels of educational attainment and the highest levels of wealth, that actually the picture is not so linear. It's not just low education, low income, high fertility, and then high all the opposite. It's actually, there's a middle zone. There's kind of this uncanny valley where if you have a bachelor's degree and if you're a woman, this is the lowest fertility. But if you continue to get education, if you get up to the PhD, and if you continue to become wealthier, you become a millionaire, it's kind of a U shape where actually you start to increase your fertility again. And my hypothesis is it's going to continue. Things are eventually going to normalize. Eventually, you're going to get a linear association where people who are considered to be high value have high fertility. I think some of that's going to be the result of technology like IVF. I think also just the degradation of marriage, the Christian conception of marriage. Things like gay marriage undermine the sacredness of the traditional Christian tradition, right? So as that continues, as people devalue marriage, they choose not to get married, maybe marriage laws are questioned or undermined, I can see that actually readjusting this relationship. That as, like, for instance, Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk or something is not restricted by alimony payments. He's not restricted by, child support laws and things like that. That they could choose to have many more children than they currently do. Maybe for those individuals, it wouldn't really matter anyway. But just in general, I think that upper class men, if there were no protections, because these protections, by the way, were originally built to help women, like marriage laws as we know them. You go back to medieval England, and we read the laws in the books, and they're sort of horrifying today, right? It would be like, if a man rapes a woman, he's forced to marry her. Now, today we view that and we say that's terrible. But at the time, I think the actual intention was to say, well, um, that in a sense, that's the punishment, is you now have to financially support this woman for the rest of your life, and you have to be monogamous with her, and you can't commit adultery. So, in this weird way, traditional Christianity is feminist, and it's there to protect women. Now, I don't think we see that in the current day. Things have changed, and that's not really the story today. But I think originally, yeah, a lot of marriage laws were meant to protect and safeguard and provide regulations so that a man just couldn't have a harem. He couldn't just be polygamous and go around and have 100 different women and 100 different children or something. He had to be dedicated. He was constrained by the law in that way, and women were protected by divorce, which traditionally was a man would leave a woman. He would flee his marriage. Now it's different. Now, because of the laws are in place, there's an economic incentive for men to divorce women rather than the other way. In the majority of cases, obviously, not all cases, but yeah, I guess that's another wrench to throw into the equation. But I guess broadly, that would be my argument for, I think as these social norms continue to change, as we continue to move away from Christianity, I think this current state that we're in, this in-between weird dissociation or inverted relationship between status and fertility, I think it's actually going to correct over time. Whether that's a good or bad thing is a different question. And I think a lot of the points I've already made, you might be inclined to say this is bad. Like, we want to preserve traditional marriage, or we want to preserve. We don't want rich men having 100 wives. We don't want. We want to preserve this tradition because we want to protect women. But I guess that's the prediction that I would make. I mean, but it might, from your perspective, that might be a dystopian or apocalyptic vision of the future. An anti-human. You said before, you brought up this point about humanism, and you feel like we're moving in this anti-human direction. And I guess I would agree. I think we're kind of moving in this transhuman direction here with science and everything. We're definitely in an in-between weird time. So are we going to move forward toward that transhuman future? Are we going to, have sprinkle a little Kaczynski in there? I mean, is there a syncretic way where you preserve the best of the past and you move forward? Are you hopeful? Are you a pessimist or an optimist on this question?
I would say that the fundamental way that I orient to this question is that whatever people want to do and have the power to do, they will do. So that, above all, will govern what actually turns out in the future. So you may be right in the things that you say, and basically it is dependent on how effective each of these interest groups are in carrying out what they choose to do. And I think an interesting perspective of mine, which I touch on in the fertility piece that we're talking about, and I broadly believe, is that it can be tempting to underestimate how much bargaining power women have, despite the fact that feminism has just wildfire raked through our culture and many others, and would suggest that overturning and changing that unilaterally, just with some men actually being able to rise above and succeed in the ways that you describe, with the sort of confines of success that you describe, including being able to, have lots of children, not be confined by alimony, not be confined by marriage, etc. I think it's tempting to take for granted that those people will be capable of doing those things. And I am not sure that, especially the last few generations of feminism, suggest that that is a straightforward question. And just, again, solely from a pragmatic, who is capable of achieving their ends question, not from a values position.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Is feminism winning, and in what sense is feminism winning? You know, I'm inclined to say feminism is winning, and it is ostensibly the object of feminism is to protect women from harm, specifically from men. And so, what are those forms of harm? Well, an easy one would be women or men. I could say it in the active tense or the passive, but women have the right to be protected from male violence, whether that's domestic abuse, whether that's rape, whether that's sexual assault. And I think that's been a huge area where feminists have concentrated their firepower and said, you know what, we're going to go on college campuses and we're going to put up posters and say that, if a woman is drunk, she cannot consent. And if you don't get explicit verbal consent, can I kiss you? That is rape. And that has been a crusade of feminists. I don't know what sort of effect that has had. I think it has had an effect. I'm not sure if it's making women feel safer. It might be making women feel safer. I think probably for men, it makes men feel intimidated or afraid that they are immoral by practicing, I guess, what we would consider traditional romantic norms of the 1950s. Baby, it's cold outside, and that picture of the sailor returning from World War II, grabbing a random woman and kissing her. Those forms of human romance that maybe were normal in the past are now stigmatized as harmful. And so men feel, it's possible that some men feel inhibited by that, and that fuels frustration and also misogyny, that men feel like they are being overregulated or being moralized against, and as a result they come to resent feminists, and then they apply that to all women, and that's sort of this narrative of incel rage. But outside of this sense of protecting women from physical harm, there's also economics and affirmative action, and making sure that we support companies that have a female CEO. We support women in these positions and board of directors and female representation. And, we need more female engineers. We need more women in STEM. So there's that economic component. But in terms of sexuality and relationships, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are some cases where you have feminists who are saying, for instance, like Leonardo DiCaprio should not be in an age gap relationship with a 19-year-old woman, and they're actually suggesting that if there is a power imbalance in a relationship, even if two people are adults, if there's a power imbalance, they're not in the same workplace. He's not her boss, she's not his employee, but that there's a more expansive frontier of critiquing power imbalance to the point where age gap relationships are not permissible. So you could make that argument and say that if feminists are able to win on that issue, if, for instance, legislation exists, you cannot have an age gap of more than 20 years, even if you're both consenting adults. Those sort of statutory rape laws. Even if that were to pass, even if something like that, social pressure and whatever, I think, on the other hand, there's still an element of feminism as part of the broader left, as part of kind of an LGBTQ-aligned movement that is against traditional relationships, and that is ultimately more open to and sympathetic to the ideas of polyamory and polygamy, and also just more friendly to divorce. And the idea that you can have a relationship with person, and there's this... I think within feminism and the left, in terms of sexuality, they're much more in favor of transactional relationships, even if they're opposed to prostitution. And again, that's a dispute within feminism. Are they pro-prostitution? Are they anti-prostitution? I'm not sure which side is going to win. But I think there is this conception of, sexuality is like a contract. You need two consenting adults, and they sign some sort of, they make a verbal contract. They make an oral contract. And then they're permitted to engage in sexuality, but there is no further obligation on either parties to maintain a monogamous relationship, to restrain from adultery, because there's this thing called ethical non-monogamy, and you're able to do whatever you want. And so, if a rich guy wants to have a bunch of girlfriends, that I don't think feminism is providing the ideological weaponry to fight back against that, whereas traditional Christianity actually did. Traditional Christianity said, no, I don't care if you're rich. You're not allowed to have a bunch of girlfriends and have a bunch of kids out of wedlock because that's adultery and you're going to hell. I guess I just see feminism as a lot weaker on that issue of protecting monogamy. And I think that as those protections for monogamy continue to be degraded, I think the result is going to be that, men who are interested in, and I think that's reflected in the data that there's some data from Norway. I think Emil Kierkegaard posted, and I restacked it, that the richest men, or the richest quartile or decile of Norwegian men, have more children. They have the most children, and it's a linear relationship. It's not the case for women. What you could be looking at is, as a stereotype or an anecdotal example, you could have a situation where you have wealthy men who have a lot of different girlfriends, but those girlfriends only have one child each. So the individual TFR of the women remains low, but for the men, their fertility is high. So I guess that's kind of the future I'm describing, where you could take, and I've modeled this as, you could have 1,000 billionaires or 3,000 billionaires, small number of people relative to 8 billion people in the world. And if they have a TFR that's twice that of the average population, let's say global TFR remains at 2.1, if they have 4 children each, then they will replace the rest of they will become, essentially in 300 years, 90% of people will be descended from those few thousand billionaires, which is, to me, remarkable, because 300 years is not a long time at all in historical terms. So I think that's, I guess, what I'm predicting, just because I think historically that's what's happened, and I think there's data to support the idea that wealthier men do have more kids than poorer men, at least within a developed country like Norway, which is a secular country, which is a feminist country by any standard. So I look toward Norway as the future in that regard, because America is still relatively religious. We're still relatively Christian compared to, secular Scandinavia. I see that ultimately as the future. And even though it's rich men are a small percentage of the population, and so it's not easily, if you divide the population into two halves, rich and poor, and you create the dividing line at like the poverty line or something, then what's happening is not exactly so clear. But I think if you drill in, you dial in on the details, a new picture emerges. And I would also consider, when we're talking about differential fertility rates based on class and socioeconomic status, I think that we're ignoring the fact that, people who drop out of high school and who are very poor, sure, they might have more kids than average, but how many of their children end up, non-heterosexual? How many of their children end up committing suicide? How many of them end up on drug overdoses? So these people are at a much higher mortality risk, and they're also, if you look at, people who are not conforming to heterosexuality, they are emphasized in the numbers. They have a higher rate of LGBTQ identification than people who have a higher socioeconomic status. So that, to me, indicates that even though they have a base level higher fertility rate than average, they also have all of these intergenerational issues that mean that a rich person with a fertility of 2.1 versus a poor person with a fertility of 2.5 or even 3.0, the rich person is going to have more grandkids. Their primary or their first order TFR will be lower, but their secondary, tertiary, and so on TFR will actually be higher because of these intergenerational effects of behavioral differences and criminality and deviancy and what we would call like non-traditional behaviors. It's much higher among poor populations. So yeah, those are some of the reasons why I think the trend that you've identified very strongly, and yeah, in broad terms I agree, but I think I think there's evidence that this is going to change in the future. But I apologize because we've really, I mean, you've written about a lot more things than differential fertility based on socioeconomic status, and we haven't really given ourselves time here to really get into all of those things. So I apologize for being monomaniacal in this area. I don't actually know how much time you have today. I had something that I'm a little bit flexible in time today, so I don't know if you want to cut it off shortly and hopefully have a further conversation about other issues, or really the floor is yours. Just let me know.
I do have some more time today.
Okay, cool. So yeah, if you have any comments on that, let me know. Otherwise, like I said, you've covered a lot of different issues, and I'm happy to do a vibe shift and jump over to something else.
I think my only response would be that the data I have seen does not support the read that you just provided, in particular, that there is a differential fertility between grandkids in lower socioeconomic status groups and people at the very top. I do not think that we are seeing the levels of specifically anti-reproductive dysfunction that you're talking about at levels to make those significantly different fertilities. It could just be a matter of the data you and I are both exposed to. I would merely note that that has not been borne out in the data I'm aware of.
Yeah, part of that's just projection, distance, velocity, acceleration. So, like, obviously, we're not there yet, but looking at how the data is changing over time. So, there's trying to remember the name of the sociologist. I believe he published Bowling Alone, and he has another book which he talks about coming apart. No, actually, excuse me. Those are two different ones. Robert Putnam is the Bowling Alone guy, but he has a friend who published Coming Apart, and Coming Apart is all about. This is Charles Murray. Sorry, the name slipped my mind. But Charles Murray talks about how over time, behaviorally classes have become differentiated in a way that they didn't used to be. So in terms of alcoholism, in terms of drug abuse, in terms of abortion, in terms of divorce, he looks at a bunch of different categories of social expression and behavior, and he says that in the past, people pretty much, it didn't matter if you were poor or rich, people pretty much divorced at the same rate. People pretty much were alcoholics at the same rate. There was no differentiation. And he's saying that over time, these differences are compounding, they're accumulating, and because of sexual selection and differential assortative mating, this is only going to become more strongly the case. That people at the bottom of the society are going to increasingly have worse and worse social behavioral problems. People at the top are going to have less and less. Now, maybe he's wrong about that. Maybe this trend will flatline or it'll decrease. Maybe rich people are going to have a lot of problems and poor people are going to get better. That's possible as well. I that's kind of my baseline for these projections, is that sort of research, and saying that if you have 4 children and there's a 25% chance that one of them will be LGBTQ, that means effectively, people who are LGBTQ, they don't have a fertility of 0, but it's going to be much lower than someone who's cisgender heterosexual. So that's one factor, is that because the incidence of LGBTQ identification is so high among Gen Z, and it only seems to be getting higher, my projection is that, and because these are differentiated by socioeconomic status, I'm not saying that there are no rich people with gay children. That's not my argument, but that there's a difference, and I have to do a better job of coming out with articles and showing the data and really laying that out, because it is an empirical question. We have to get into the studies, and we have to ask, where are gay kids being born? Are they being born in California or Georgia? And as it turns out, it's Georgia, not California. They moved to California, and so that means you'd think it's a counterintuitive result. but and the reason for that is differential poverty rates. Um, so yeah, I have to do a better job on the back end of demonstrating that, and convincing people, and citing the sources and whatever, to make my case. And I'm totally. I think your skepticism of what I'm saying is understandable, because it contradicts what most people are saying about this issue and kind of the popular sociology surrounding it. So, I'm happy. We'll have to stay tuned, and if I can prove it, if I can put the money where the mouth is, then hopefully I can change some minds on this topic. But we can table that. We've talked a little bit about religion, and kind of your relationship with religion, and you have some articles on homeschooling, which I associate with religiousness. What overall? I mean, I think you have a nuanced take on this. What are kind of the pros and cons of stuff like homeschooling, in your opinion?
I am generally mildly anti homeschool. I don't generally talk about it that way because if someone wants to homeschool, I don't think it's compelling, much less my business, to suggest that they shouldn't do it. However, I think most of the benefit of homeschooling is replaceable with highly invested parenthood overall, and specifically with having interesting conversations with your children, educating your children at home. And I think you will see homeschooling parents talk about how much less time homeschooling takes than standard schooling. And that makes it at least chronologically compatible with standard schooling measures. And broadly, I think we already put a lot of pressure on parents in our current society in a way that we haven't in past eras. And we don't support the pressure we put on parents the way we used to with communitarian support. So that combination of things makes me pretty skeptical about homeschool, but not in a way that would make me ever say someone who wants to homeschool is making a bad decision. I do have some case by case skepticisms about homeschooling when it comes to actually replacing the value of the education in question. And all of these reflect the reality that homeschooling is a lot of different things, and people tend to talk about it as if it is one alternative, a single unified alternative, when there are people who are at the very worst end of the spectrum, explicitly abusive, and they're keeping their kids homeschooled to hide them from the state. And no sane person, plenty of people who homeschool are not supportive of that. And then it's not very common, mercifully. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who essentially pay the best minds they can afford, which can run a lot of money to tutor their children in a lot of really impressive things. And so you're going to get much higher variance outcomes with homeschooling. I am skeptical that it is as high value as some people say, although it clearly has a lot of value to offer on a number of axes, in particular religiosity. If you want to communicate a different value system to your children than they're going to get in public school, yeah, okay. I mean, I can understand why you would homeschool under those circumstances. Broadly, I think people who hated school want homeschooling to be universally recognized as better than public school in a way that cannot be justified by the data. I think there are individuals for whom public school is not a good fit, or for any number of reasons. School district is one of them, since you get a decent amount of variance by school district. But I am lightly skeptical of homeschool while thinking it could provide outsized value in some cases for some pupils.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I find it ironic that people who live in like rural conservative religious areas where the public schools are probably fairly conservative themselves because of how the school board is organized, and just the fact that when you go to school, most of your acculturation is peer to peer, not necessarily top down, the teacher shoving it down your throat, but like if most of your peers come from conservative religious families, they're going to be conservative and religious, and then you're going to be influenced that by being put in that environment. And so I find that a lot of the people who are most pro homeschooling are like, yeah, I live in the middle of nowhere. I live in Nebraska and I'm pro homeschooling. Whereas the people who are anti homeschooling, it's like they live in urban areas where, as you said, there's huge variation, like in the quality of schools. Like if you live in a very expensive neighborhood of New York or LA or something, the public school might be top tier. And if you live in a not so great area of the city, then you could be going to a terrible school. It's true for every big urban area of the United States, partially because of de facto racial segregation, but all sorts of other aspects as well. So it's ironic to me that like if I were living in a poor neighborhood in Chicago, yeah, I would definitely homeschool because I feel like I'm not sending you to school. The school is like a prison. There's gangs, there's crime, whatever. It's a big waste of time. So obviously I'd homeschool. But yeah, if you're there seems to be a misidentification of people who have a fear about the influence of public school. They don't understand the variation that you're talking about. And I also want to bring up something anecdotal. I wrote an article where I highlighted the story of Christina Heinemann, who is a detransitioner. That is, she became transgender, female to male, and then she detransitioned. And when she talks about how she initially came to transition, she was saying, well, I was homeschooled. And then when I was 14, my parents sent me to public school. And it was a very alienating experience. And I ended up finding myself among the quote unquote weird kids who were all transgender. Every single one of my friends in my friend group was transgender. So I felt left out and I felt the need to conform to that. And so I, through motivated reasoning, rationalized the idea that I was, I don't know if she was lesbian or bisexual, but she said, okay, well, I guess I'm actually a man, and then later regretted that choice when she was removed from that environment. She was, after in her 20s, I suppose, decided that was the wrong choice to make. And I described that, and I got some response in that article that says, you should write about a statement you made kind of offhandedly, I think, in the footnotes. I said, I think taking someone from a homeschool environment and throwing them into public school is probably a form of child abuse. Now, obviously, every child is different. Some people are resilient. Some people are able to handle that shock. But I think there's a kind of culture shock when you're homeschooled and then you're thrown into public school, especially while you're going through puberty, especially at the most sensitive period of identity formation, where you've already calcified a lot of your social norms, but things are you haven't yet gained the confidence and self-esteem of adulthood. So, I mean, teenage years are the years when people have the lowest self-esteem and they have the greatest level of anxiety and depression, which, my model of depression is that people become depressed because they are trying to assimilate into a group because they feel rejected socially. That might not be true in all cases, but that's my general model of why there's an evolutionary benefit to becoming depressed. Because if you curl up into a ball and you adopt infantile traits and you have low energy, you're perceived as less of a threat by foreign tribes. And they're like, oh, this guy, he just sits around all day and he doesn't have any strong feelings and he's kind of like a big baby, doesn't take care of himself. So I guess instead of killing him, we'll assimilate him into our tribe. And this is why people who are depressed tend to be prime candidates for joining cults, because they're really looking for that kind of, group identity. And that's why people who have unstable upbringings, who, their family's broken, they don't go to church, they don't have that sense of identity, why those people tend to be the most depressed. But, so I think she had depression. And she went through that process. Now, with that being said, to then take the argument a bit further, if somebody is homeschooled and then at age 18, they are thrust into a college system or a university system, I don't think that's quite as bad as age 14. But I still think it can be disruptive. And I know anecdotally, and I've written about people who had that experience. I'm trying to remember his name or her name, who Derek Black is now transgender. But Derek Black was homeschooled in a white nationalist community, and then at the age of 18 was thrown into a liberal college environment and is now transgender, and repudiates her family's views. So to me, it's not exactly. I don't think actually at age 18 we suddenly, like, there's this hard black and white line where suddenly we become fully formed adults and we have everything under control and we fully self-actualize and know who we are. I think age 18 is still a pretty unstable time in a person's life, and again, not for everybody. Everybody's different, but yeah. So that's why I would be worried about homeschooling, is because at some point your child is going to leave the home and they're going to go out into the big wide world, and that's shocking, and that can be destabilizing, and that can be harmful. And so that's why I would say, if people want to, like you said, they have a religious disagreement with public school or the values, they want to give their children a different set of values, I'd say, make some money and move to an area with those values. But yeah, if you're going to be committed to homeschool, at the very least, you have to be plugged into some community that can help the child transition into adulthood, where it's not a black and white shock of, well, for 18 years I lived at home and didn't really, I had no experience of the wider culture around me, and now all of a sudden I'm being thrust into that. It doesn't seem like a recipe for success. So yeah, I guess I'm broadly in agreement with your nuanced view there. And yeah, I haven't seen the data specifically on this question, but my intuition tells me that kids who are homeschooled end up having poorer social skills, and I have not seen any evidence that they are then going to college and outperforming. Because we disrespect the public school system a lot, and we say, oh, public school is like a prison, it's a waste of time, it's daycare. But I don't see the evidence that kids who are homeschooled outperform kids who went to public school. I think the outperformers are private schools. I think if you can afford private school, absolutely that's an option. But yeah, homeschooling, I mean, even in the ancient world, even aristocrats would hire tutors. They didn't say that mom and dad are the best equipped to teach the kids. They hired, experts to do it. So, I mean, that would be another
homeschooling is high variance. Yes. Yeah. So you do see outperformance by homeschoolers at the tails. And that's, as you allude to, what you can afford to give your children in homeschooling is the most central feature of how they're going to turn out. And yeah, I have met a lot of people who have been homeschooled and have some deficit in their education, particularly in math, that I did not usually see in students who were schooled in public school. And that is not inevitable, obviously, but it reflects the reality that homeschooling is high variance. You get a lot of different outcomes based on parental income, but public school and private school also vary with that. And you get a lot of variance with the child themselves. For example, there is an argument to be made for homeschooling really, really outsize intelligence and easily bored kids, basically. But I feel like you basically always have to have that standard schooling bores me element, or you have to be able to afford the really impressive tutoring to justify or to make homeschooling a really, really competitive bet compared to standard offerings in a very good school district.
I would add into that I wish that as a country we were more supportive of boarding schools, because boarding schools were a huge part of the ancient world. They're a huge part of Victorian England. I mean, they're a huge part of America. I mean, they still exist. But I think actually the boarding school experience is really good for a lot of kids, taking them out of that parental environment, giving them a full-time, giving them a community, really. And it's ironic because in the past you could say, well, people were more plugged into churches, and we had higher social trust, and so boarding schools weren't really that necessary. But now that you've got a lot of families where there is no religious life, there is no communal life, there is no relationship with their neighbors. They don't even know who their neighbors are. And so it's like, well, taking kids and plugging them into an environment where they're surrounded by their peers, there's consistency. I personally wish that I had the economic opportunity to be a part of that, and I didn't. But I wish that I had, because I would come home from school. I mean, it was the opposite experience. I would come home and say, well, I'm bored. I'm just going to hop on the computer. I'm going to hop on the internet. I wish that I had friends around me. I didn't have a neighborhood where I could just play with the other kids. I would have liked that. I would have liked to, okay, school's over. It's time for me to, walk next door to the dorm room or whatever and hang out with my friends. And so I, I didn't want school to end. Not that it was perfect. It wasn't a perfect experience, but it was good enough that I preferred it over the home environment because I didn't have community at home. I was very lonely. So I wish that we supported as a society boarding school as an option. Not that I think that a lot of people would be very hesitant. It would probably be very expensive as well to say that every child must go to a boarding school. I'm sure there are parents, especially the ones who are sympathetic to homeschooling, but maybe they haven't quite made the plunge yet. They would be like, whoa, you're taking away my kid and I can't see them. I can see them on the weekends, but I don't get to see them every single day. I think a lot of parents, especially with regard to these sexual abuse scandals that have gone on in public schools, they think, oh, boarding school is a recipe for sexual abuse because as much as you're saying that we need school teachers to observe children for signs of domestic abuse, I think that parents would also make the case that we need parents to observe children to look for signs of abuse going on at school. So that it would be hard democratically to convince Americans to support a transition to boarding school as the norm. But I wish that we would provide for exceptions. To me, I'm very pro-education. I'm very in favor of funding education, and I'm very in favor of making it accessible to people no matter their family status. And so I would support, saying that we should have public boarding schools. Maybe there wouldn't be that many of them. Maybe the demand would outstrip the supply. We wouldn't have the funding, but you could even do it on a scholarship basis of if you get this certain test score. I would have tried a lot harder in school. If somebody told me, hey, if you get straight A's, you can get into a boarding school, I'd be like, all right, I'm just going to study 24/7 now because I want to get out there. I've always been someone who wants to get out into the world. And, maybe then eventually I would get bored of boarding school and I'd want to get out of that too eventually. But, I think that's something that we're really kind of not allowed to talk about, that not because it's necessarily taboo, but just because in itself, but because like the idea of changing our education system is so difficult. Like, what are the teachers' unions going to think about this? The charter school movement is part of this whole battle of, what sort of options can we afford kids? Are we going to allow parents to send their kids to a Montessori school? Are we going to allow, what public options, free options are we going to afford parents? What level of school choice are we going to provide? I would love if we were able to open up that conversation. Because every kid is different and every kid is going to do better in a different environment. And, gifted programs are something that I had the privilege to experience, where it's like, okay, if you test in this way, then you don't have to do the same math course as everybody else. You get to do something on the computer instead. Germany actually had a program that I think they're phasing out, but it made a lot of sense to me, where they said at age 12, we test the kids, and that determines your high school experience. And so if you're underperforming in school, we're going to gear you toward trade school, plumbing, electrical work, those sort of skills that are not very academic. And if you're very high performing, we're going to place you in a very, demanding high school, a rigorous academic setting that's going to prepare you eventually to go on to do PhD work. And if you're in the middle, you do something in the middle. And that to me made a lot of sense. Because that's not gonna ever be a perfect system, but I so much more prefer a diverse tiered system with different standards and different environments for different kids rather than a one size fits all. Just seems to always be the worst of all worlds to do a one size fits all. I think that's a lot of the reason why parents are increasingly pro homeschooling is because they feel like public school is one size fits all. And the only way to get around that is geography. You have to figure out where the good schools are, and you have to move to that area rather than being able to have a diversity of options within your local area, or a tiered system like the old German system, or something else where you could send your kids across the country to a boarding school and then see them on holidays, which again, for a lot of parents, that would be unacceptable. That used to be normal in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, we decided that was not good. I think for class reasons, I think it was associated with the upper class would do that. And we wanted to kind of unify the classes in Britain with the Labour Party and in America. We wanted to do away with that. That was considered to be too, classist, snobbish. But we still have private schools, so they never outlawed that. It's a huge part of Britain still, the grammar schools and Latin schools in America. So I just wish we you're talking about the capabilities of children and the preferred environments of children, and I wish that we would give more public diversity, public option. Maybe charter schools and school choice is going to move us in that direction. But yeah, outside of this topic, which I think you've made a number of good points, you also write about sexuality, and you have this article, Against a Materialist Lens on Sex. What exactly does that imply? That there's a spiritual form of sexuality opposed to material sexuality? How do we differentiate between those two?
I chose not to give a title to the opposing view because I couldn't find one that felt accurate to what I was trying to point to. But I knew that I felt that it was overly materialist, overly interested in the tangible to have a framework of sex where sex is about achieving completion with a willing partner. And both of you take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that your partner is willing and that you're on the same page about any infectious diseases you might have and the possibility of pregnancy. And I think on a person-to-person basis, most people don't actually quite conform to that view. Our cultural narratives often pay their dues to that view in a way that I think impoverishes the average person's view of sex to some extent. And I think there can be a tendency to ignore the ways that sex is about more than the physical experience of sex. Even for non-religious, non-spiritual people, I think the full qualia experience of it is not limited to physiological arousal and completion. And so I specifically argue in that piece that we are doing a disservice to men in particular, who we culturally model as the more sociosexual sex. We assume that they want more sex than women do generally. That is obviously true. Under a lot of circumstances, they're less discerning about partners for evolutionary reasons. But you don't see in our modern estimation of anything any argument that would suggest that men have a good reason to refrain from having sex with anyone who would be willing. And I think you broadly see sexual practices that map to that. And I think there are downsides essentially for that, for the men themselves and not just for society. And I was interested in interrogating that, especially from what I see as a masculinized perspective, as opposed to accusations of a feminized society. I think you see a lot of emphasis on the tangible and the measurable and the quantitative in a way that suits the masculine perspective and denies extremely important quantitative parts of human experiences, which obviously has massive relevance in sex, which is such a huge part of how especially men connect to their romantic partners, that it feels like we're doing a disservice to buy just quantitative and materialist explanations and arguments and narratives wholesale and ignore anything deeper about how and why men might want to engage in sex other than the orgasm that they get from it. I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. I was saying that this is an interesting point with respect to rising porn use, because there's a, in how do I say this? It's no longer necessary for men to have a real sexual partner to have an orgasm. So on this argument that there's a physical need or a psychological need, but there's this necessity that men have to engage with in regularity, otherwise they go crazy or their quality of life goes down. The idea that they need a physical partner, for better or worse, that's just no longer the case. So,
I mean, it's never been the case strictly. Porn just makes it easier, right? The visual stimulation makes that easier to achieve, but you've always been able to achieve that without a partner.
Right. Physically, you're correct. Yeah, physically, men have always had that ability. But psychologically, I think that, and I don't have data on this, so I'm just kind of making anecdotal assertions. But I think that if pornography was absent in society, and maybe not just pornography in itself, but the culture that we've constructed that surrounds pornography, that is influenced by pornography, I think that if pornography did not exist and we sort of desexualized our culture in certain senses. Now, you could actually make the argument that we're desexualized, that you actually post this graph that shows people are having less sex. So isn't that's evidence of desexualization. But if you could somehow limit pornographic stimulus and erotic stimulation at a certain level, then I think there are actually a number of men, if you polled them and you said, or you could conduct an experiment where, you remove porn from the equation. How often do you need to achieve an orgasm, or how often do you engage in masturbation in the absence of pornography? I think there is a difference. Now, it's not a black and white difference. It's not to say that, it goes from daily to never at all, but I think there would be a reduction. And I think it would change the equation. I think it would change the social equation. But as it is, there's it's strange, and it impacts us. I think in contradictory ways, that pornography is free, accessible, ubiquitous. I think that it does change men's calculus. It does change men's view of women. It changes sexuality. It changes the way that men and women experience sexuality. Obviously, it cannot have a physical impact, unless you're talking about brain chemistry or something. But it is a psychological stimulus ultimately. Porn doesn't reach the screen and grabs you. You can see it visually, but otherwise it's just it's a digital phantasm. So there is a sense in which it's like a dream state or a purely psychological mechanism. And I guess what I'm thinking about here is, why is it that men, I think the point that you're making, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's that you're arguing that yes, you're sitting men down. You're saying, look, you could sleep with a spectrum of women, within a certain time frame. Right?
Maybe you could,
depending on the man, right?
You could.
Yeah,
yes.
There's variation, right? So some men have a very small, limited options. Some men have larger options. But you're saying to all of these men, whatever your range of options is, be discerning be selective. Don't just whatever the cat I mean, I don't mean to be insulting to women here, but I'm simply saying that what I'm getting from what you're saying, or how I'm interpreting it, is saying that, you could have a hookup on the first date with someone you're not compatible with. And men do this, right? They'll say, okay, well, she's not good enough to date, but I'm going to sleep with her anyway. She doesn't fit. Whether that's an objective standard, right, where in egalitarian versus egalitarian view, whether there are some human beings who have a greater contingent worth or inherent worth or potential, whatever whatever our view is on that question. Clearly, there are people who are in different states of relationship readiness. So you could just ask somebody, like, are you dating for marriage? And if they say yes, that's kind of a more selective pool of people who think that way than if you say, are you dating for marriage? Oh, no, I'm just messing around. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that men, in your opinion, they need to understand that there is a cost to being less selective in your sexual partners, and there is a benefit to becoming more sexually selective. And I think there's a number of ways to view that. You brought up like STDs in the article, but I also think that sexual relationships require energy. They require psychological energy, emotional energy, and that there is, if you as a man are constantly pursuing sexual relationships with people where there's not there's no hope for stability or compatibility there, there's no hope for something longer term, then you're kind of exerting a lot of energy that could be placed on something else. And it's hard for me to see how to convince men of doing that outside of religion. And the reason why is, again, it's not for purely physical reasons. It's not that men need to orgasm and therefore they just have to sleep with whoever, wherever, whenever. But it's that I think there is a social status game that men play and they internalize that says, I am more of a man, I am more masculine, sort of the higher body count I have, or the more accessible women are to me, the more opportunities I have, the more that I create for myself by adhering to a certain pattern of life. Right. So, we have stereotypes about the type of man who's optimizing for sexual accessibility versus a man who's in a different pattern of life. Right. Somebody who they're getting into, for instance, drug use is a path towards sexual accessibility, hanging around that crowd, or getting into a certain musical genre, or, certain subcultures. So organizing your life around that as a man, there's a cost to that. There's a time cost. There's an energy cost. And if men were more selective, then they would be able to conserve that energy and, put it toward other pursuits and ultimately achieve more and be more satisfied in their lives. Am I on the money here, or do you think this is? Because I guess the final note I make before turning off to you is that I think there's a lot of peer-to-peer, homosocial, not homosexual, but men tell other men, like, oh, you're a virgin, you haven't had sex yet, or you haven't had sex in a year, or whatever. Like, there's a sense in which men bully each other on how much sexual activity they're engaging in. And so it's like, oh, if you don't have a girlfriend, or you haven't had sex recently, or you're a virgin, men will, in the same way that women bully each other, men apply social pressure to one another. And so I think, because men, like women, are seeking, they internalize social standards and they feel guilty or they feel bad about themselves, they have low self-esteem. One of the ways that men try to fix that problem or feel better is by engaging in casual sexual relationships with people they're not compatible with, which it sounds like you're saying that's a bad idea, and, they need to figure out how to restrict that and address those questions in a different way.
Again, I think what people want to do and are capable of doing is what they're going to do. So, broadly, my analysis here is hoping to suggest that there might be a reason to want something other than the maximum amount of sex with the maximally socially status securing people you can get. And I think that your argument, which is compatible with mine, namely that there are time constraints and energy constraints on what you pursue, including sexuality, and that you should devote your energy carefully for that reason. I think that even arguments like that are not really in the social water. As you know, they're certainly not, they don't appear from the outside to be part of how men often interact with each other around the subject of sexuality. And men tend to inform other men on how to act across a broad spectrum of things. And my piece is mostly interested in suggesting that there might be a benefit to being more selective than as much as I possibly can get, or as good, as much of the best as I can possibly get than the culture is currently offering them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's difficult to make these arguments because I just think that the way that people experience um, the restrict, like when we argue for a restriction on human sexuality, it's really difficult to like analytically, not impossible for some people, but it's difficult to like analytically say, here's the utilitarian argument for why you should restrict your sexuality. Because most of the people,
Why do you think it's difficult to say?
well, it's not difficult to say, but I think it's difficult to. I think like the executive functioning and prefrontal cortex activity. People have different levels, and for the vast majority of people, it's hard to like even take STDs and safe sex and condom use. People who you tell, well, if you sleep around with people, you engage in risky sexual practices, you don't use protection, you're likely to have these bad consequences, and STD rates are rising despite sex education, despite the fact that we're telling kids at 12 years old or maybe even earlier, we're saying, look, we're giving you sex education, we're telling you what it is, we're telling you what to do, here's the rational decision that you should make. And yet STD rates are rising. It's not because healthcare is going down, it's not because, I don't know, you could argue our immune systems are compromised or something, or it's like maybe the sex education is flawed. But again, even the things that sex educators tell kids to do, and they say like use a condom and use safe sex and think before you act. I mean, that's the sex education I got. I don't know what other people are getting, but it wasn't licentiousness. It wasn't saying, oh yeah, just do it wherever, however, whenever, with whoever. It's all good. You'll be fine. No, it was like, this is a serious thing. You got to think about it. And yet, despite more sex education than ever, I think, versus 100 years ago, you just didn't talk about sex and people figured it out on their own or through crude peer-to-peer sharing of information. I think that STDs rates rising shows us that you can't just rationally argue most people. Some people maybe, but you can't rationally argue people to make good sexual decisions. Like, because
Perhaps
go ahead.
I would say that is at odds with what you were saying before about how men encourage other men to get more sex at all costs. And I'm sure that when men are talking to each other about, I would expect that when men talk to each other about so and so is a loser because he hasn't had sex yet, that doesn't come with, but of course, when he does, it will include condoms. Like, oh, did you hit it sexually safely, bro? I don't think is really a common way to talk about this. So I think it's a bit of a cop out to suggest that that's actually because people can't be expected to control themselves. I think it's a question of where the values are coming from and who holds more sway in men's individual values creation. Clearly, it's not public school.
Oh, I certainly agree. And I guess what I'm saying, I think you feel like I'm maybe contradicting myself here, but I'm going to try to clarify is that I think that if you state to men, if you say like, hey bro, here's a rational argument for why you should be sexually restrictive, and don't just follow the crowd or whatever, or do what your peers are telling you. They're not going to listen. They're going to listen to what their dumb bros tell them. They're not necessarily unintelligent, but I just think, making a rational argument is not going to overcome these cultural forces. And therefore, if we want to actually change people's behavior, a rational approach or making an argument isn't necessarily going to work for most people. It's going to work for some people, but it's not going to work for most people. And that's why I think religion is much more effective, because it doesn't speak to people rationally. It speaks to people socially. It speaks to people culturally. It speaks to people through symbolism and metaphor, and through some kind of pre-rational or even anti-rational lens. And I think that it is much more effective at changing most people's behavior. But through stigmatizing, saying sex is sinful, sex is dirty, and God only likes it when you have sex in a marriage. I think that kind of rhetoric is more effective at changing people's behavior. Although I will say, even people who believe all of that stuff still engage in risky sexual behavior. So I'm not exempting. I'm not saying, evangelical Christians, they're all doing it by the books or something. Of course, there is premarital sex. Of course, there are risky sexual practices. But I think as a total society, overall, the reason why STD rates are rising has to do at least partially with the fact that we've become less religious. And religion is really the only way that you can change people's sexual behavior, or switch out religion for culture, or switch out religion for, psychosocial environment, or whatever term you want to use. But I'm just saying it's distinct from rational argumentation, the kind that like you and I can have as individuals. We can debate what's better or worse from a utilitarian perspective or something, but that might not be something we can preach to the masses and expect to have as good success as we could if we brought down the fire and brimstone and started thumping our Bibles and so on. Not that I'm going to be doing that anytime soon.
There's a fascinating implication here that there are massive limits to modeling quote unquote wokeness, the left, liberalism as it in its current iteration as a religion, because liberalism is certainly interested in increasing safe sex. And I don't think it would be correct to blame STD rates on people who are incapable of having the impulse control to do it. I'm sure that they represent a certain percentage of the problem, but I think there is clear evidence that wokeness is not a particularly powerful religion if it is incapable of commanding the same level of social control that Christianity did. And there might be reason not to consider it a religion at all based on that particular metric.
I agree with you that just equating leftism or liberalism with religion, we are losing some information there. We are, especially if we're just in a binary between Christianity, leftism, liberalism. There are certainly distinctions. And I would agree with you that the people who are the most liberal and the most leftist, ideologically, they would be interested in increasing safe sex practices. I mean, these are the people who sign up to become sex educators and sex therapists, as they are like, absolutely, there's no reason why you should not use a condom and so on. And, but I think you're underestimating the link between behavior and personality. And again, this is just an empirical data question, so we'll have to wait till I publish the article on sexual behavior and personality and STD rates, because there absolutely is a difference demographically between populations in terms of impulse control and sexual behavior and STD rates by a factor of, by a very large factor, by a very unambiguous factor. So yeah, that's just an empirical question, but I guess
that would suggest that there is a population for whom a rational argument is a perfectly reasonable way to make this case, does it not?
Oh, no, I totally agree with you. And I'm sorry I haven't made that clear, but I agree with you that there are some people for whom a rational argument is impactful. But I'm arguing at the societal level that if you wanted to change behavior, like the best and quickest and easiest way to do that would be with some kind of symbolic force, like, and it wouldn't even necessarily have to take the form of religion or traditional Christianity, but just a campaign to say, like, put out a bunch of Hollywood movies where you stigmatize sex and you say sex is dirty and evil and sinful. You don't have to use Jesus when you said that, but just basically promoting prejudice against casual sexual activity in the culture from a pre-rational point of view, just through basically advertising, associative programming. That's going to have a greater societal effect than rational argument. But I'm not arguing that there is no population for whom rational argument is impactful. I'm hoping that I'm within that population, and I think you're within that population, and there's other like us, but I think we're in the minority. I think most people are not really rational. I mean, I guess that's an oversimplification because people have a degree of rationality. But if I think as an adjective, just like I would say, some people are strong, some people are weak, even though strength is a spectrum, and we all have some degree of strength because we're alive, and the human body requires musculature in order for us not to collapse into a pool of jello. So everyone has, even people with cerebral palsy have strength. But I'm going to say some people are strong and some people are weak because it's a heuristic, and it helps us, make snappy decisions, and oversimplifications are sometimes good. So in this case, I'm going to say some people are rational, some people are not rational. Again, that's not strictly speaking true because we have a spectrum of rationality throughout the population. But yeah, definitely on that bell curve, people who are highly rational, way more impacted by rational arguments than people on the lower end of the bell curve. But I would say that median, like the average person, is not really rational enough for them to listen to what you're saying or what I'm saying, and for them to be like, this is a good argument. I think I will use my executive functioning to change my behavior now. I think most people are not capable of that. But yeah, that is an empirical question, and well, to be continued.
Well, partially what I'm saying is that I think you are reading my essay to have a scope it was not intended to have. Broadly, it was a modest argument for considering an alternative behavior rather than something that I hoped would result in mass societal behavioral change. And I generally write about things that I think would benefit other people or that might be worth examining rather than necessarily trying to write about a society that I hope to craft from the written word somehow.
No, I think that I meant no criticism, and I understand. I'm not actually trying to contradict or say that you should have written a different article. It should have been in larger scope. I was, I guess, making a remark in addition to that, which is to say that we can kind of recognize these things, and yet I think there must, if we do want to change society, which maybe you don't, and that's fine, but if we did want to change society, we would probably need something like religion. We would probably need some kind of pre-rational symbolic regime, some kind of civic religion at the very least, in order to change this or that. But there's nothing wrong with the article that you wrote, and I'm not disagreeing with it. So I hope you didn't take that all as too critical or unfair scrutiny. But yeah, I'm actually reaching the end of the time that I have today. You've allowed me to go on much further than I had originally planned, which I'm grateful for and thankful for. I'm not sure actually. Before we started this, you had mentioned maybe being curious or wanting to ask me any questions, and I'm not sure if after going on for so long about these topics, and maybe I was beating a dead horse and drilling too far down into certain things. Obviously, I want to give you an opportunity. If you have any questions for me or final thoughts or final words, or if not, then let me know what you're working on and who you think we should be reading and checking out.
I think in summation, I would say that I'm always interested in having conversations with people who have ideas that I think are interesting and that come at problems in an interesting way. And so I've certainly enjoyed reading some of your writing and reading some of your prescriptions and ideas. They are genuinely unusual in many cases. And I also do not have much more time myself. So I would say I simply I write on Substack if people are interested in work on I don't know, some of the things we've talked about today. They're welcome to check it out. And I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Well, I appreciate it. I enjoy it. I feel like I was getting a bit pedantic and maybe what is it? What is it called? The narcissism of small differences. So I I I endeavor to maybe improve on that. But I appreciate you being patient with me here today. And I think you have a lot of interesting things to say. I definitely recommend people check it out. So that link will be in the description for everybody. But until then, yeah, appreciate your time and hope we can speak again.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All
Bye.
right, take care. Bye bye. All right. So yeah, I feel like I maybe maybe came at that as if I was or what is the term? A one-sided debate. I felt like I maybe communicated in a way that made it seem as if I was criticizing, undermining, attacking, scrutinizing when that wasn't my intention. So I I do apologize in terms of I can be a bit caustic. I can be a bit people say autistic. So that wasn't my intention. But yeah, that's all for now. If you liked it, I think there was a lot of good thoughts, a lot of good interesting ideas. I mean, I really felt like the discussion we had initially was quite about the different forms of egalitarianism and inegalitarianism. I thought that was kind of opening up thoughts in my head and making me think, oh, I could write about this. This is something I want to pursue further. So I definitely appreciate Eurydice coming on. But I guess my intention with these discussions is always to foster harmony and to begin with disagreement and to end with agreement. That's always my desire. So when I feel like I haven't accomplished that or haven't achieved that, I get a bit self-critical. And people have advised me not to be self-critical. People have said, I did the Bentham's Bulldog interview, and at the end I was like, oh, I don't think I really formulated that properly. And it seems like I may have been coming off as, what is the term, tedious. I may have been coming off as tedious in that interview. And I got some feedback by somebody who said, the interview was fine. It's the self-criticism at the end that looks really bad. When you criticize yourself, it makes you look really bad. So you should stop doing that. And so I apologize for apologizing. I apologize for the compulsive self-criticism. So that's all for now. Thanks, you guys. You can tell I've been working out a lot of stuff, and I'm everybody. We all have limited energy, right? So I have limited energy too. So thank you guys. This is a stimulating conversation. I hope you found it stimulating as well. And I will see you, or no, I won't see you because you're an anonymous part of my audience. You will see me, and you will hear from me next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.